A warm welcome to all of you in front of your devices. Thanks very much to the Baeck Institute for the invitation to chair the next panel. And I also want to thank the whole organizational team for doing such a wonderful job. I have the pleasure and honor to open the third day of the Shared History Conference. And as everybody who was following the last 2 days knows, the panels are very vivid, and please, and this is my first organizational announcement, please use the Q&A function, the chat function in your browser or in MS Teams. So I'm very much looking forward to a vivid panel, the opening panel of the third day. I was asked to keep my introduction as short as possible. So I will just mention what the topic is and one or two aspects which are of importance to me, and then we will start the debate. My name is Andreas Eberhardt. I have the honor to lead you to the following 60 minutes. Our topic today is memory and commemoration, historical narratives of minorities within discourse of the majority society. And those of you who have followed the last two panels will see that there are, at least to my observation, a lot of overlaps to them. We are approaching this topic, and probably these are more than one topic. I think these topics from different perspectives. We have a researcher who is analyzing media, especially film. We have an educator, and I would say an educator on a personal journey, analyzing individual and group encounters. And we have a curator of an exhibition observing visitors' reactions. And I'm very glad to welcome the panelists, Aya Zarfati, Adam Kerpel-Fronius, and we will start with Liat Steir-Livny. Liat is a senior lecturer on the Department of Culture at the Sapir Academic College, a wonderful place. I've been there several times, so if you come to Israel, just take a trip. It's just a 1.5 hour ride from Tel Aviv. And she's also a tutor and course coordinator for the Cultural Studies MA program at the Department of Literature, Language and the Arts at the Open University of Israel. Her research focuses on Holocaust commemoration in Israel from the 40s until the present, a very early area, the 40s. It combines Holocaust studies, memory studies, cultural studies, trauma studies, and film studies. She is the author of many articles and 5 books. Her main topics are the representation of Holocaust survivors in Israel cinema, the changing memory of the Holocaust in contemporary Israel culture, Holocaust humor, satire and parody in Israel culture, also very interesting. And recently she has published a work about remaking of history by the third generation survivors in Israel, which also leads us to her input of today. But very firstly, Liat, allow me one question. Is there a third generation of survivors? What is it?
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Andreas, for this kind introduction. And in my opinion, when I talk about Jews in Israel and when I talk about third generation, these are not only biological descendants of Holocaust survivors, but because, in my opinion, again, Israel is a unique sphere of Holocaust awareness. This is a post-traumatic society which acts out the Holocaust daily. I believe that second generation and third generation are more than cultural terms than biological terms, meaning these are the people who were born after 1945 and since childhood were educated to learn about the Holocaust, to remember the Holocaust since kindergarten until we are grown-ups. And so, in a matter of fact, we are all second and third generation to the Holocaust.
Yeah, thank you. You will introduce us to this topic of today, the hybrid identity of Jewish immigrants from Germany to Eretz Israel by The Flat, a documentary which was, surprisingly for me, the third most viewed film in Israel 2011. And you will analyze the way a Jewish couple imported Berlin to Tel Aviv. The screen is yours, Liat.
Thank you very much. So you are right. This is a part of my last book titled Remaking Holocaust Memory, in which I discuss documentaries by third-generation Holocaust survivors in Israel. And you can see here Arnon Goldfinger, he is the director. The film is The Flat. Arnon Goldfinger is a third-generation Holocaust survivor. He's the grandson of the couple that you can see here, Kurt and Gerda Tuchler, who were forced to immigrate from Germany in the 1930s after the Nazis rose to power. And within this case study of The Flat, I would like to introduce a much wider topic of this love, this desperate love of the Jews who were forced to leave Germany to their former homeland, which they loved and adored, but didn't want them anymore. And this desperate love is manifested beautifully in The Flat. And when I discuss this theme, I would like to discuss, first of all, their generation and this generation's immigration to the land of Israel, and the way The Flat manifests this one-sided love, this desperate love within this shared history by representing the artifacts in their apartment and by using two figures, the book expert and an expert on the Nile. So first of all, let's begin with the immigration of Jews from Germany. So in the 1920s, there was an immigration of Jews from Germany due to the economical crisis following World War I and anti-Semitism, but the vast majority immigrated to the USA. Only a couple of hundreds immigrated to the land of Israel. But things changed in the 1930s after the Nazis rose to power. First of all, may I remind you that the gates of the United States were closed since 1924. And on the other hand, Palestine was flourishing under the British mandate. There was also the transfer agreement between the Jewish Agency and the Nazis, which enabled the Jews from Germany to transfer their capital to the land of Israel. So in the 1930s, there were around 600,000 Jews in Germany. About 10% of them, around 50 to 60,000 from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, immigrated to Palestine from 1933 till 1939. They accounted for about a quarter of the immigrants which arrived in Palestine in these years. But even though they were only a quarter of the mass immigration in those years, this immigration is titled within Zionist historiography as the German immigration, because of the huge impact these newcomers made on the economics, culture, trade, and so on. So just a few reminders. They found themselves in cities. They liked the urban place, but they also established new towns and cities like Nahariya and Kiryat Bialik and so on. They developed the industry and established factories which are still alive until today, like Teva, Osem, Ata, and others. They also influenced urban life. They developed the hotel industry in the country, the culture of cafes, constructed orchestras, and more. They completely changed the consumption culture within Palestine. But they didn't do it only in the public sphere, they also did it in their private spheres. Now, many preserved the German influence within their homes. Many, and of course, these are not everybody, you can never talk about 50 to 60,000 people as one unit, but many of them turned their homes into a German bubble. Within their homes, you can find the decor that you can find in many cities in Germany in the 30s. Grand pianos, dark and heavy armchairs and sofa, dressers proudly bearing porcelain. Of course, bookshelves filled with the works of Schiller, Goethe, Heine, and so on. In these homes, they cooked German food. They kept the 2 to 4 very known Schlafstunde, and so on. And the encounter between them and the veteran Israelis, Eretz Israelis back then, was very, very complicated. First of all, it was because of the temperament. I don't know how many of you know Israelis, but we are described as being very blunt, free-spirited, maybe even a bit rude, a bit. And the German are described as the total opposite, very restrained, and there was a clash between these temperaments. And of course, the knowledge of Nazi brutality caused many Jews in Palestine to oppose the immigrants' wish to preserve German culture. I mean, they talked German on the streets and they were harassed because of it. They published newspapers in German. Many people in the land of Israel back then didn't like it. And there were even cases of harassment due to this friction. And to add to all that, the Jews who came from Germany saw the culture as prior, or as a much higher culture than the culture in the land of Israel. Their culture was superior, and here it was the Levant, and of course it didn't add many points to them. And so you can see that from the 30s, the snide name Yeke was invented by the veteran Eretz Israelis. Now Yeke is a code name to describe someone who's very punctual, humorless, very tidy, tie-wearing, and so on, the complete opposite of the new Jew, the model of Zionism, which again was very blunt and free-spirited, and so on. Now, moving to the film in a way encapsulates this encounter by showing how Kurt and Gerda Tuchler, again, who were forced to leave Berlin in 1936, they may have immigrated to the land of Israel and to Tel Aviv, but they continued to live their lives as if they were in a German bubble. This is a very unique story in a way, because besides the fact that they kept their German lives, the film reveals that they kept relationship with a Nazi couple before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. So this is the extreme twist that the film brings with it, but the culture the film describes, the way they built their house, they decorated the house, shows a picture or a portrait of a much bigger frame, maybe even of a generation. And Arnon, their grandson and the director, opens the film when showing these pictures and when he gives this monologue. When I was a child, I loved to come here, meaning the house of his grandparents. Once a week, I would cross the center of Tel Aviv, go up 3 flights of stairs, and arrive in Berlin. This is the Berlin bubble they built for themselves. And look at the decor in the house as Arnon keeps talking. I didn't want to learn German, and my grandma never learned Hebrew. So instead, he says, we sat down and we had a chat in English. Look at all the artifacts in the apartment, and they sat down and spoke in English over apple strudel and Swiss chocolate as if they were still in Berlin. And when I showed this highlighting of the artifacts in the apartment, in the flat, I remember the ANT, the Actor Network theory, which was developed in the 1980s, included scholars like Bruno Latour and others. And this theory analyzes connections between human and non-human object. And the word they use is an assemblage of human and non-human factors who affect each other. And non-human objects, in their opinion, play a central role in shaping social processes and situations. The ANT describes human and non-human as actants and grants them equal amount of importance within webs or social situation. Meaning, when we want to check a socio-culture situation, we shouldn't check only the humans, but we must check the non-human factors as well. And this theory echoes in the film, especially in the first scenes in which Arnon describes the emptying of the apartment. The film begins when the parents have already perished and the family needs to empty their apartment. So the family enters the apartment and opens all the closets, and what we see here are the fashion artifacts of the grandmother. And what you see here is completely detached of the heat and steam of Tel Aviv. These are the fashion objects which were imported straightly from Berlin: the gloves, the scarves, the bags, the shoes, and of course this mink or whatever that the family laughs about because they can't comprehend that somebody actually wore this thing, because it has nothing to do with Tel Aviv or the heat in here or the Levant as well. The fashion items of the grandmother is of course an example to the ANT, because through the items, through the fashion items, we can understand this shared history. Gerda may have immigrated from Berlin to Tel Aviv, but in a way, she was still there. She was living her life within a German bubble, wearing the clothes she wore in Berlin and the fashion she used to wear in Berlin. This was her world for a woman, a very educated woman who didn't even bother to learn Hebrew. And Arnon, during the film, wants to highlight even more the distress of the Jews who were forced to leave Germany, but Germany never left them. And another way is to use Micha Adler, the book expert. Again, in the first scenes of the film, Arnon and the family ask Micha Adler to come to the grandparents' house to check the books, to see if they can sell something, or maybe people will want it. And Micha Adler, the book expert, Eyeke himself, says the following: they lived here for at least 50 years, but their hearts remained in their first 20 years of life in Germany. I'm sure they suffered greatly. Now, when he says they, he doesn't mean only the grandparents. He talks about, again, maybe even a generation. Thousands of people who were forced to immigrate from Berlin, they didn't want to come to the land of Israel. They wanted to stay there, but the Nazis gave them no choice. But in their hearts, they stayed there in Berlin. And what happens during their time they empty their apartment, that suddenly they find stacks of the Nazi journal called Der Angriff, the attack, in the closet. And Arnon wonders, why does his grandmother kept all these years this Nazi newspaper? And his mother begins translating, and from the newspaper they discover this almost fairy tale of a story. In the 1930s, a Nazi called Leopold von Mittelstein, who believed that the solution to the Jewish problem was immigration to Palestine, toured Palestine for about 6 months. Arnon's grandparents apparently toured with him and became friends over these months. And what he discovers during the film, to his amazement, that this friendship didn't stop during the Holocaust, but it resumed in secret after the Holocaust, and it also included visits of the Tuchlers in Leopold von Mittelstein's house and the exchange of family photos and gifts. And moreover, Arnon digs deeper and he finds out that not only his grandparents remained the friends of a Nazi couple, but this Nazi officer was not a low-ranking Nazi, but a high-ranking Nazi. First he was in the SD, and then afterwards he served the entire war in Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. And Arnon cannot fathom this relationship. He, as a third generation, cannot understand how can it be that his grandparents, his grandmother, her mother was murdered in the Holocaust, and she remained friends with the Nazi after the war. How can it be? And he doesn't know how to solve it. And then he turns to this expert of Nazism and denial, Professor Michael Wilt. And Professor Wilt discusses this craving of Jews who immigrated from Germany to their former homeland. And when he talks about Arnon's grandfather, he says, a persecuted Jew who grew up in Germany and saw in it his homeland wants to believe that there must be at least one good German who accepts you as a human being. And this need to be accepted, to know that not all the German society didn't want them, but there was still at least two persons who believed that they are cultured human beings, in Michael Wilt's opinion, helped the couples to establish their relationship. So, as we can see here, to sum up this discussion, what Arnon does in this film is that he creates this assemblage of human and non-human factors. He shows by using the artifacts and the book expert and the professor of Nazism and denial that the Jews who were forced to leave Germany during the 1930s did live, but in their hearts they remained there. And they kept on loving and missing the homeland that betrayed them, and by then saw them as subhumans. Thank you very much.
Again, apologies. So thank you very much, Liat, for this fascinating introduction into not only the film, but also the topic and the method you described. We will have the chance for Q&As after the 3 inputs. So I will follow up with Aya Zarfati. She will give us an input titled Talking about the Holocaust in the Post-Witnesses Era, the relation between archival sources and family memories. Aya is a staff member of the educational department at the Haus of the Wannsee-Konferenz, and since 2015 she's working there in Berlin. Born and raised was Aya in Israel, and she came 2010 to Berlin to study modern European history at the Humboldt University. And she did a master thesis about the significance of the Wannsee-Konferenz in Israeli culture, based on interviews with visitors of the Haus of the Wannsee-Konferenz Memorial. Her research and works are related to dealing with the past in the Israeli and German societies, memory culture, and educational approaches, challenges and chances in working at memorial locations. Aya, before starting your input, you came to Berlin in 2010 for a voluntary service with Action Reconciliation Service, Aktion Sühnezeichen. Somehow surprising, also fascinating. Shouldn't it be the other way around for a third-generation survivor, to quote Liat?
The interview to get accepted to Aktion Sühnezeichen was held in Jerusalem, and I had something to do in university, so I couldn't make it with public transportation, and I don't drive a car. So my dad took me to this interview. I didn't want to tell my parents in advance, only after I would get accepted or not. And he sat in the car, and I came back from the interview, and I told him that I also have to pay a participation fee, and that most of the projects are in former concentration camps. And he looked at me as if I was completely out of my mind and said, wait a minute, you, the Jewish person, is going to pay the Germans money in order to spend a year in a concentration camp. And this was, of course, a way of putting it to the extreme, but it wasn't an easy concept to sell when I left. Yes.
Fascinating. Lots to talk about, but actually now you will explain how you shared your history. Introduce it like a kind of individual journey you were undertaking, and how also this became a part of a concept of unshared history. Aya, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this interesting conference. This paper combines two perspectives, my perspective as a researcher and educator with another perspective or function, that of being a descendant of German-speaking Jews that were persecuted in the Holocaust. And it shows how a family research, which started as a private undertaking, transformed or was integrated into a local history project with youngsters in the hometown of my grandmother, Leoben, in Austria. In the short time that I have, we'll give you an overview of this project, because I think it is an example of how we can speak about the Holocaust in the post-witness era, and it also gives us a chance to reflect on the relation between archival sources and family memories, and how those can be combined in a useful manner within an educational setting. In 2016, in view of the debate on refugees in Europe and especially in Germany, I was, like many other colleagues in the field, looking for sources that would tell the history of the Holocaust from the perspective of flight and escape. This aspect of the story was, of course, always present, but not necessarily at the focus of our narration. And I recalled having letters written by my grandmother's parents between the years 1938 and 1941, talking, of course, about this need to leave Europe, and which my parents still had in their apartment. So during a visit to Israel, I took this family archive, it's the blue folder that you can see in the presentation. I took it with me to Berlin, and this is how my family research started, to the biographies of my great-grandparents, Max and Berta Verdisheim, which led me to archives in Europe, in Israel, and the United States. I also contacted the local archive in the city of Leoben, and also discuss with them the possibility of laying Stolpersteine stumbling stones for those family members, which is how I was contacted last year by Anna Maria Rath, a young teacher from das Alte Gymnasium Leoben, who wrote to me that her class is looking to take a sponsorship on such a stumbling stone, and if I would be willing to share with her information about my family. And I offered on my part to personally come and speak with those pupils, which is how it came about that last June I was invited to the school to give a workshop on the persecution of my own family, which is a weird concept and naturally not something that an educator usually normally does. So while preparing this workshop, I posed myself several questions, which I would like to share with you, and then discuss the implementation of this project. So my first question was, what is mine to tell? The Holocaust is definitely not my experience. It's not my story, but my grandmother, who passed away in 2017, cannot tell it anymore. How do I bridge the sense of unfamiliarity? Had my grandmother met with those pupils, she could have spoken with them with flawless German, with clear remnants of an Austrian dialect and grammar. I did speak with them in German, but it's not my language, it's not my hometown. So how do I make those participants realize that my family members were not immigrants, they were natives? How do I pertain my educational standards? Here I'm referring to the Beutelsbach consensus, which sets the minimum criteria for civic education in Germany since the 70s. And one of the principles is not overwhelming the students. So in this case, the question of emotional distance was important for me to maintain. Where does the value of a third generation account lie? I will go back to this question at the end. How should I address this history in Austria? Now, without implying in any way that the dealing with the past in Germany is a closed and finished process, or that it turned out perfectly. It didn't, but in Austria, there was a different course of dealing with the history, and putting it very generally because of time limitations, Austrian society developed a victim theory, eine Opferthese, perceiving itself as the first victim of National Socialism, when in fact the majority of Austrians welcomed the unification with Germany in open arms. And this is especially true for Styria, the place where the city of Leoben lies. It is a conservative city of about 25,000 inhabitants, for you to have a general idea of this place, and there is no Jewish life there today. It was small also back then. And the last question, which archival sources can be used in order to show that this is a shared history? For the main part of the workshop, I let the sources tell the story, even though, of course, gaps remained in those biographies, which I constructed mostly of my great-grandfather. I was really amazed by how many primary sources I was able to gather in archives regarding his fate. I will note that many of those documents stood in contradiction to the story that my grandmother told us about his fate. So it was also a journey in which I was confronted with many discrepancies and new discoveries. This is also the point to note that many archives are already sharing their holdings digitally. So it is a trend which is bound to increase in the upcoming years, and it is already possible not just for descendants, but also for academics, teachers, and so on, to research from home online. And here you can see the largest archives of, on victims of Nazi persecution, the Arlesen archives. Based on primary sources I found, which are both ego documents and also, of course, documents produced by the perpetrators, I created individual working groups for this class on central themes that you would speak about generally when speaking about the persecution of European Jews. So those were immigration and escape, expropriation of property, deportation, and the exceptional case of helpers. And those sources enabled me to tell a multi-perspective story and meet my educational aims. And for the sake of the topic shared history, I will read here two, showing people's sphere of action, even within the limited possibilities of a dictatorship, and touching upon knowledge regarding the persecution of Jews within the non-Jewish population. Max Verdisheim had a shop, a business in Leoben. I found a very large so-called Aryanization file in the local archive of Styria, and it shows how many people who are not SS or SA people, but residents, other merchants, are actively involved in destroying this family business and affecting decisions which are made by the government, so to say, about their fate. Next to those accounts of profiters, I used letters I found in the family archive, which Max Verdisheim wrote in the very last weeks of his life. And he wrote them to an unknown non-Jewish woman in Leoben. And it's clear from those letters that they are acquaintance of his that are sending him packages. And also the fact that this woman is at all corresponding with him is, of course, not to be taken for granted. So my aim was to show the complexity of human nature and the making of choices. I started a workshop with a small segment from an interview made with my grandmother by Yad Vashem 20 years ago. And there is a short sequence in which she speaks about a trip we took as a family to Austria and also to Leoben. We spent 5 minutes in this town because we came and found out that 6 months before the family house was demolished and a new house was built there. You can see it on this photo. And my grandmother goes on in this segment about how incredibly ugly this house was that was built there. So I started a workshop with a shared space and with my observation of my grandmother in this space when I was at the same age as the participants. We also went together after the workshop at school to this building and discussed the question of whether this architecture should provoke such a strong reaction or whether she just needed a way to outlet her great disappointment coming to this place again. The pupils asked different questions, and one question stood out for me in particular, and it was, do you have a special connection to this city, or is it just another place like any other? It was asked with a perfect Styrian dialect by a pupil whose family came from Syria to Styria just a few years before, and therefore, as he told us, a question he posed himself. So even though neither his grandparents nor great-grandparents were living in Europe during World War II, he was able seemingly to identify with some of the workshops themes and also take with him those very central questions of culture, identity, and belonging. And I think that this possibility to reflect with a family member about the aftermath of Israel the aftermath of history, had an impact of these pupils, as well as on adults who came to an event organized by the school in the afternoon. And it was a nice way of the school to show appreciation for the work of the pupils, but also their commitment to this topic. For me, it also showed the unshared history, as I was told by many of the guests, that the majority of the school collegium, the teachers, did not come to this event. So this was also a very visual act in this space. Where does the value of a third generation account lie? So some things I already mentioned, but going back to what Liat spoke about, German Jews importing their culture back with them to Israel, I also realized that I imported something with me back to Berlin, and that is the self-confidence of someone coming from a majority society, which I think, at least in theory, makes it easier to stand in front of people and talk about those subjects. And if you listened yesterday to one of the panels, this was also discussed, the lack of sensitivity maybe of Israelis to this topic, but you can combine that maybe together. I think this is something very important. I also realized in retrospect, not when beginning with this project, but at the end, how much my motivation for this was rooted in the transition that I have made in the last 10 years from being a member of a majority society, an Israeli Jew, into being a member of a minority society, a Jew in Germany, and how that feels like also in light of growing anti-Semitism in recent years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aya. Lots to talk about also regarding or connecting to the other panels, as you said, and also I think also to what Liat has said. We are following up with Adam Kerpel-Fronius. His input is named Contemporary Knowledge Transmission and Desiderata in the Majority Society. Born in 1975 in Budapest, Adam came to Germany in 1990. He has studied political science and history in Freiburg, Wrocław, and Berlin. For me, very interesting. He's a really kind of witness of time also. Since the inauguration 2005, Adam has worked at the Memorial for the Murdered Jews of Europe, where he has developed educational concepts, organized events with survivors. Is working recently as desk officer in charge of the internet platform Memorial Museums. He also has edited several books about survivors and was the curator of the traveling exhibition about the determination camp Mali i Trostenetz. And you've wrote me that this was your most important project. Why this, Adam?
Mali Trostenetz was an extermination site near Minsk during the Second World War. It was probably the biggest extermination site in the occupied Soviet Union, and there have been small memorials there, and it has been known in the Soviet Union is a very important site, but there was no central memorial site there yet until 2015. And nowadays there are huge complexes there, and it was a place where tens of thousands of Jews were murdered who were deported from the German Reich and from today's Czechoslovakia and Austria, Czech Republic and Austria, to Minsk, who were murdered there, but also many local Jews from the Minsk ghetto were murdered there at that site too, and many non-Jewish victims too. So the number of victims was at least 80,000, but it has been not a very well-known place either in Germany nor in other places. And what we have done there is actually to make an exhibition, which is a joint exhibition by Belarusian experts and German experts, and to try to reconcile our way of seeing history and our way of telling about history. That was extremely exciting because we have very, very different memorial cultures. The way we remember history is very different in Belarus than here. And it was also a great thing to learn more about each other. Of course, this year, the events in Belarus have made Belarus a bit better known in the media, in the international media. But these steps were extremely important to get to know each other. And these exhibitions are still traveling around. It will be shown in Dortmund from January on, and it has been seen in other places as well. Let me come to my presentation.
Sorry for stealing your time, because I think probably there are some comparisons, because you have a lot of international guests at the Holocaust the memorial. And okay, so please, I hand it over to you, Adam. Sorry.
Thank you very much. The question is, why are we showing a presentation about the Holocaust Memorial at a conference about 1,700 years of Jewish life in German-speaking lands? What are we trying to achieve here when we are doing a conference about Jewish life? And the thing is that many of the people actually only come into the first contact with what is Jewish, with the concept of Jewishness, through the Holocaust, especially true in Germany, but also in other places as well. And so the idea was, through the example of the Holocaust Memorial, we would like to show how the official state memorial, which is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, dealing with Jewish identities and Jews in general, how are they being presented? Because another important institution in Berlin is, of course, the Jewish Museum, but hundreds of thousands of people visit the memorial each year and see also the exhibition. That's important to say. The Holocaust Memorial is not only a memorial, it also has an information center. Originally, it wasn't intended. It was through the intervention of politicians in 1999 in the Bundestag who said, if we are going to support this politically and financially, there must be some historical context given to it, to the visitor, because otherwise it's just too abstract. And I have to say, this was a very wise thing indeed to do, because we experience very, very often that people come to the memorial, look at it, think it may be interesting, but they look at it with different eyes after they have gone through the exhibition and have been actually given some information or been came into contact with some testimonies as well. So I would just like to give you a shortcut of how this exhibition is built up. First of all, it begins with a chronology of events going from 1933 until 1945. And that's already very surprising for some, because many people expect this exhibition to give a lot of background about anti-Semitism in Europe, or why did the Nazis come to power, or who were the Nazis anyway, and their point of view, but it's not. So it's other institutions can do it much better, maybe, and have more place for it. For example, topography of terror is only about a few minutes walks away, which is absolutely concentrating on the perpetrators. Here we are very much, because this is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, this is from the point of view of the victims. And if you look at this picture, you can see 6 portraits at the end of the hall. They stand symbolically for the 6 million. They are large portraits, 2 meters high, and they are identified victims where you can read their names and where they come from. Both genders are represented, different age groups and different social backgrounds. So that gives the idea of what are the 2 main important issues in this exhibition. One is the European dimension of the Holocaust. We don't only show one country or one region, but we try to give a concise view of what happened in occupied Europe and the places dominated by the allies of the Nazis. And that it's very much from the point of view of the Jewish victims. It's their stories which we are trying to tell. But how do we do that? The Room of Dimensions is the first room which people enter. On the walls, you have the names of different European countries and the number of Jews murdered from those countries, which is an important thing, because many, even very well-educated people, also in Germany, have no idea that less than 3% of the murdered Jews, or the 6 million, were from Germany. Most people would guess that maybe about a third must have been from Germany, but then we have to confront them with the fact, no, over 97% were not from Germany, and the vast majority of the people murdered in the Holocaust were Eastern Europeans, if you define Eastern Europe by the countries which were east of Germany today. So about half of them from Poland alone, and over 1 million Soviet citizens. That's something which is new for many, many people. But in contrast to the site, we have in the floor, you have little pieces of paper, testimonies, diaries, little notes written by people during the time of persecution. And it's in very different languages, and we translate the quotations and give them input, put them into context. For example, what you see here would be a telegraph. And we also have, for example, a page from a diary written by a 15-year-old boy in the Łódź ghetto, which provokes questions. Why are they writing at all if they are going to be killed anyway? So also by the motivation of the people who are writing, which is extremely exciting as a theme if you are working with pupils and with school groups, if they are here for a project day. Then there is a room of names, which is different from all the others, because there's not so much information given. It's only names being projected on the wall of individuals, and you can hear very short biographies on them in German and then in English. And we also give the information, if we would read all the 6 million names of all the 6 million victims, day and night, it would take almost 7 years to do so. I actually have to say that this is maybe the only room where we really see significant differences between Jewish and non-Jewish visitors, because for many visitors, this is just a room. They go inside, they orient themselves, what is this about, and then maybe they go on after listening to 1 or 2 biographies. But for many Jewish visitors, this seems to be very central room, because it's the memory of individual people with their names written on the wall. But the main room where we are dealing with Jewish life and Jewish culture is the room of families. And from the very beginning, the idea was not to talk only about the Holocaust and how people were killed, but about who were these victims. And we try to work it through examples. So we are showing 15 different Jewish families from 15 different regions of Europe. And the way we do it is we have one central picture of the family in peacetime, before the war, before persecution. And then we tell about how they lived, what were their professions, how important was religion for them in their life, how were they integrated into majority society. And those are very, very different stories. And in these 15 families, we have very different families. And let me come back to the example of Belarus, because we have 2 families from the territory of today's Belarus. One of them is from then Eastern Poland, which is basically a Yiddish shtetl. They are all speaking Yiddish. For them, Poland is their official country, but Poland is very far away because they are on the periphery of this Polish state in the 1920s and 30s, and they are basically autonomous. They speak Yiddish. They have their own institutions. Many of them, the young people, are very, very Zionistic. Zionism is very important for them, and many of them later go on and are active in these Jewish partisan groups in the forests. And only 100 kilometers away from them, in Minsk, we have a very different picture. We have a very Soviet family, which is integrated into Soviet society, where religion is actually totally suppressed in Stalinist Soviet Union. So they become electric engineers, join the Red Army, and it's the same country today, but totally different families. And then I wanted to come to the one German family we show, because that's something which their German visitors are very surprised. They would probably expect in a place like this German stereotypical Jewish families, and I'm speaking here in well, symbolically, because many people really expect stereotypes. The main stereotypes people are coming with are basically that German Jews were living in big cities. Most of them were lawyers or doctors, well-to-do people. They fought in the First World War, got decorated, were German patriots, but they were still persecuted and killed because they were Jews, which is a very important part of the story. But what we are doing here, we show a very different type of German Jews, which was nevertheless typical for that time, so-called Landjuden, so countryside Jews. We show a family from Baden, from the very border of the German-French border region. The family Dreyfus. There's no relation to Alfred Dreyfus, the colonel of the affair in France. But they were, well, they lived in a small town, well, basically a village called Altdorf, have been living there for generations. They were kosher butchers. They were integrated into society there, but still for them Jewishness and their Jewish identity was extremely important. And we tried to tell their stories through that and this part of culture which has been forgotten since then, basically. Here we have Leopold Dreyfus, the guy with the beard and the pipe with his legs crossed in the middle. This is from the First World War in 1916. But we also show the synagogue of Altdorf, which has been, of course, destroyed in 1938. Actually, the pictures comes from the Leo Baeck Institute. Which is also a thing. During the so-called Kristallnacht in 1938, not only in the big cities were synagogues destroyed, but everywhere. And this is something which is not that well known. Of course, nowadays, even in smaller places in Germany, now you have plaques or memorials reminding people of these places, of synagogues which have been destroyed, but they are not part of the collective memory anymore. The other picture we show there is Alice, the daughter of the family, and that's a costume party, a Fasching party in 1928. She was murdered later in 1943 in Auschwitz, whereas Leopold died in Theresienstadt. So these are the stories we are showing, and what is of course very important for us too is not only to show them as helpless, passive victims, but also to tell stories. How did they try to escape? How did they try to get away from danger, to show Jewish agency during the time of persecution? So with that, I would coming to an end, but this is something which we do in all our other projects too, when we are doing exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, for example, of 1938 Kristallnacht, or about the trial of Eichmann, or many other exhibitions. We are always trying to show individual stories to better understand the motivations of the people and of what happened to that. And we do that in our video archive and on our other projects as well. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't overextend my time too much, and I give back to the studio.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think you were the only one who really were keeping into the time, and sorry, apologies to all the listeners that I'm not as strict as I probably is supposed to be. So we will open the round for Q&A, and I think the first questions were coming, and I was very glad to see that it already has started a debate between all the people who are listening us on in the Q&A section. So the concept of second and third generation, Liat, you described it as starting people who were born 45 when I was asking the third generation issue. So this is something that people were talking about. You've researched to this about this also, so probably you just want to share your thoughts about this with us.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, thank you for the questions, and I'm sure that you can understand that when I get only 10 minutes to talk and I exceed the time anyway, I cannot get into all the details, but I've written a lot about second and third generation, and you can find the various facets of research regarding second and third generation, especially in my book, Remaking Holocaust Memory. And in this book, I describe the many differences between the second generation, meaning those who were born between 1945 and let's say the 50s, and the third generation who were born around the late 60s until let's say the mid 80s. And in my book, I also represent several opinions regarding these generations and the differences which we must be aware of. So first of all, I'm going to talk about it really shortly. There is a debate in the psychological research whether we can talk really about second generation or third generation. Is it really a separate group with its own psychological dimensions and characteristics and so on? And not all the scholars agree. Some say that yes, some say that no. There is a vast research about it. And again, you can read all about it in my book. And I also show in my book the difference in the cultural text that these generations produce. The themes, the topics second generation deal with and represent in their films, in their books, etc., are different than those that the third generation represent in their films. My entire book is about the differences in documentary cinema between the second generation and the topics they were interested in showing, and the third generation and the topics they're interested in showing. And I'm showing in my book that the third generation broadens Holocaust debate. I mean, the second generation were interested in, there's several topics, and the third generation who grew up in a different period when the Israeli society had already changed and Holocaust awareness had changed, produced completely different cultural texts. So you can find all the research and the references and everything you want in my book, Remaking Holocaust Memory, and a lot of research about it. A lot of research, of course, I'm not the only one who wrote about it, and I'm using also cultural research and psychological research, and you can read all about it. Now, about can we really assess if biological descendants of Holocaust survivors are more aware of the Holocaust or not? I don't think that we can assess it at all, because I live in Israel and I can see within my students, and I have taught hundreds and hundreds of students, that sometimes you can find students who are third generation, meaning their grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and they're not so interested in the topic. I mean, they know it, they know the family history, but okay, it's over there. On the other hand, there are students whose grandparents came from Yemen or from Persia or from other places who are completely obsessed with the Holocaust. They have no family connection whatsoever to the Holocaust, and they tell me that from childhood they were obsessed with the topic, they've read every book and so on. So I'm not so sure that we can really assess that the third generation biological descendants are more into the subject than their peers whose parents came from countries in which the Holocaust didn't affect them. And regarding the last question about the term Yeke, again, with the changing of the generation, and this is very interesting, second generation and third generation of Yekes are now reclaiming this code name. And the term Yeke, you can find it by now in Facebook groups of second and third generation. They have conferences titled Yeke. They publish cookbooks with the title Yeke and so on. So have the second generation and the third generation have turned it by now to this kind of word or title that they are holding very proudly, and they're describing themselves as Yeke. And in the Facebook group of the Yekes, the title says, if you're not familiar with the Schlafstunde, then your place is not here. So now they're wearing it like a crown, what was before some kind of a curse or something.
Yeah, of course. I think also you have to say something about this, so please.
I just wanted to remark, because I think two things. First of all, this biological thing, I realized when I was researching that I found this term third generation from a biological perspective also problematic, because it assumes that my grandmother was the first generation and nothing existed before. But those great-grandparents, they had a life and a world which out of this Israeli perspective, they just didn't exist, and life began again with those who came to the land of Israel in this respect, which I thought is not unproblematic for me to use in a biological sense. So I like your cultural definition, Liat. And I also want to note, I also think it's completely true that there are many people that are not biological connected and are definitely very much connected to this history, but I think from my observations, they would sometimes have to explain why they're interested. So at the Haus of the Wannsee-Konferenz, we had a wonderful volunteer with an Ethiopian background, and how Israeli groups asked her all the time, like, what is she doing there? Much more than they would ask me what I was doing there. And she had a hard time with that it was not a given that it is her history as well as ours. That was my comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. Adam, there's a question regarding the location of the memorial. I just want to add one observation, because everyone, actually nearly everyone, is using Google Maps. And if you open Google Maps seeking the memorial, right next to it, you find this type of arrow saying Führerbunker. And if you observe tourists in Berlin, you see, and this is not an official location, nothing is there, but you can observe how many people are going to this place or to this location instead of the memorial, or also to. So how is the proximity? This is the question about the location and the Führerbunker.
I'll try to be short. The location of the memorial, the very first idea for the memorial came up in 1988. At that time, Berlin was still divided, and the idea would have been to put the Holocaust Memorial, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, on the site where today you have the topography of terror. So on that site, you had the headquarters of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, so the SS and the Gestapo. That changed after the wall came down, because suddenly many other places were available too. But many consider it that we are lucky that it wasn't put there at the topography of terror, because many people said that that ground was contaminated. It would be very difficult to have the memorial to the victims on the very same ground where you had, well, the perpetrators, Riyad Heydrich and all the others. The place that was chosen, but the most important aspect was to put it right in the middle of the city, in the heart of the city, in the place where you had the new capital city developing. So it's very near to the Reichstag, and it's extremely near to the Brandenburg Gate, and it's very near to Potsdamer Platz. The Führer bunker was there because it was the center of power of also of Nazi Germany, of course, of Prussia, of the Kaiserzeit, so Imperial Germany, and then Nazi times. But I have to say that the memorial itself was at a place where there were never any buildings, because that were the so-called Ministergärten, the gardens of the ministries which were there, which were the Foreign Office, Agricultural Ministry, and of the Presidential Office. But we know that we are extremely near to the Neue Reichskanzlei, the new chancellor, which was built in 1939, and the old chancellery. And one more thing about the Führer bunker, it was when in the GDR, so East Germany, they developed new buildings there at the beginning of the 80s. And it was at that time that they opened up what was left of the bunker, and then they basically built over it. Now what we have there is on the very spot where you had the entrance to the bunker, today you have a parking lot of cars and the children's playground, and otherwise it's the place where people live. And in 2006, since 2006, we have an information plaque there, which was put up because there was a lot of pressure to put some information up so there's some context, historical context of what is going on there. And it was put up in time for the Soccer World Championship, which drew millions of people to Germany at that time. And we are very thankful for it, actually, because it's a very good information, providing information in English and in German and putting things into context. What was there in the bunker? Why was it significant? What happened there in May 1945? And it's not really used as a place for neo-Nazis, which is also surprising for us. I think I've only heard about once in the 15 years that on the anniversary of Hitler's death, there were candles there or something, but that's the only and very isolated event I've heard of in 15 years. And otherwise, people are going there to inform themselves.
Thank you, Adam. I remember very well the debates at that time, and the huge criticism, and among probably partly from me, that this memorial was built in an artificial place nearby the Führer bunker and not at one of those authentic places. We have lots of them in Berlin, but we are running out of time. There's a question, Liat, about the perception of the flat in Israel. Have you some information about this for us?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, you said earlier how successful it was in Israel, and I just want to highlight that the flat was successful worldwide. I mean, the film opened in many festivals and it won awards and so on. And as far as I know, it also entered the German curriculum of high schools, at least in some parts of Germany, because they thought it can encourage people to ask their grandparents about their past. So it became a very important tool, not only in Israel, but worldwide. And I have this specific piece of information, but I can't use it because if I do it, I'll make a spoiler about the film to those of you who didn't watch it, and I want people to watch it. But I can assure you that when you watch the film and you can see Ada, she is the daughter of Leopold von Mildenstein, the Nazi, and the way Arnon, in a way, attacks her with the information about her father, the responses in Germany and Israel were astonishing. This is a very difficult scene. Again, I don't want to spoil the film for those of you who didn't watch it, but I just want to say that in Israel, after the film was shown, Arnon was attacked for attacking her with the information about her father, which she didn't want to hear. And in Germany, of all places, people completely understood him and they turned against her, whom she refused to acknowledge what her father really did. So this was, I think, the totally opposite perspective you were expecting to find in Israel and in Germany. So this is one little story about the film.
Thank you, Liat. The very last question, and you only have 30 seconds for it. I am sorry, because we're running out of time. I want just to wrap up, because it's highly interesting. This couple imported Berlin to Tel Aviv, and you are part of importing Tel Aviv back to Berlin. And it sounds, and I remember very well your introductory statement, the reply to my question, that you are feeling much more like a minority than then probably 2010. Just tell us some short words about this.
This is Aya. This is Aya, not me.
Yes, and it is.
Sorry, Aya. Sorry, Liat. Aya, of course. Sorry.
It is a very hard question to answer in such a short time, but I think the core identity remains strong, because I think the experiences you make in your formative years stay with you longer. But I think, and this goes to the panel yesterday, that within time, within more integration into German society, having more German friends, understanding German language better, it also clashes more between you, so me in this case, and German society. When you come, you are naive and you see in many cases, or you don't see, or you don't understand when people are giving you anti-Semitic comments many times. So it took me time also to feel part of this group.
Okay, thank you, panelists. It was a pleasure. Thank you all who listened. You all have the chance to meet the panelists again in the coffee break in the evening. So I'm looking very much forward for the continuation of the conference, and back to the studio. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.